Hello, my name's Alistair Griffin. I'm a consultant social worker in Hackney Adult Social Care.
Good morning. My name's Carl Chandra and I'm a university lecturer. And together, Alistair and I welcome you to this dementia workshop. We're hoping that we can bring to you some interesting ideas and some different concepts and topics for us to consider good practice in social work as you work with people living with dementia. So again, very good to be here and to be with you all. As we go along, please do ask any questions that you would like to ask. And you can type those in, etc., and we'll try to respond to those as best as we can. But if we can't, and if there are any which we need to get back to later on or after the session, we certainly will. So please, again, do feel free to engage with us. We really look forward to that and would welcome that most certainly. Just to begin with, and just to give some context really to where we're coming from and how we are going to progress and go forward in the Walked workshop. Coming back to what essentially is a very basic question around engagement and what social work is about. I thought it would be useful just to, again, set the template in terms of practice and just to remind ourselves really that how social work sits within the in delivery and how we work within that framework. So social work is practice, of course, within a network of human relationships, and relationships should be at the heart of all good practice, be it within groups or with individuals or communities. But Prospera Tedder has beautifully written around that social work and the service use relationship and states that it should be built on trust and respect. Another way to kind of look at that and in terms of taking an ecological approach or a systemic approach would be, a systems approach rather, is to think of it in terms of the individual, which is at the heart of social work practice. And in terms of engaging from that perspective with the different organizations or the local community, or even wider frameworks than that globally. But the point being that this session that Alistair and I are delivering comes very much from the basis around good social work practice, with these fundamental tenets being the platform for which we're coming from.
I think that's really important that although this presentation is some kind of guides and context of people who might be experiencing dementia, you're still working with people and individuals, and kind of wider social work practice and theory still kind of applies to the people you're working with. Yes,
very much so. And so we hope that we will be able to really focus in on those areas, and as you said, Alistair, to think about theory and to look at legislation, etc., and how that can support best ways in which to work.
So I'm going to start off with some kind of context around what is dementia, what are certain types of dementia. So we've got some kind of true and false questions here. And obviously if we were in a kind of room teaching, we'd kind of ask it and try to get some responses. So have a little kind of look at it quickly and have a think about what the answers might be. So the first one, hopefully, is relatively familiar to people. Memory loss is the first symptom of dementia, which is true. The second one, which is 500,000 people in the UK have dementia. Is that true or false? It's actually false. It's near around 800,000 and ever increasing.
Yes, and worldwide, very much so too, so not just the UK context.
And that increase is partly due to the kind of diagnosis is improving, but also kind of increased life expectancy as people get older and more people can get diagnosis of dementia and experience it. Every year, dementia costs the United Kingdom £26.3 billion, and that is true. which kind of highlights, and actually that's, we'll come on to later, is actually more than is on cancer or other kind of serious similar health conditions due to the cost of care, which is very prescient for a lot of social workers work in this area. It's a little more fun one. Eating sardines can cure dementia. Now, obviously that's false, but actually there is some evidence around kind of diet, kind of a Mediterranean style diets, things like that can actually improve chances of people getting dementia. We're not really sure why that is, and there are early studies as well around type 2 diabetes being potentially linked to dementia, although that's very early days.
Yes. Maybe that omega-3 that you get from the oily fish as well.
Yeah,
I think meant to be.
So I think it might be might be some effect. So the kind of the oils in some fish can can improve brain development. And one person develops dementia in the UK in every 4 minutes. That's true or false? It's actually false. It's actually 3 minutes. Which just gives an idea of the kind of numbers of people that across the country. So you think there's around 60 odd million people in the UK. 1 every 3 minutes is diagnosed with dementia.
Yeah.
So how would you describe dementia? What is it, essentially? So think of dementia as actually more of an umbrella term. So you think of, say, like fever, with malaria, is actually kind of a collection of symptoms rather than an individual diagnosis. So there are over 200 different types of dementia, which shows the kind of range of things that can cause it. And we know what some are caused by, we don't know what others are caused by. The symptoms that it kind of displays are around mental ability, so things like memory, thinking, problem solving, perception, concentration, awareness of your environment, the kind of fundamentals of kind of brain functioning, essentially. What links it from a medical point of view, and I should emphasise that neither me or Carl are medically trained, so this will be very kind of loose in terms of the medical side, but it is around kind of damage to nerve cells in the brain and the wider nervous system. So it basically prevents it from functioning normally. So that could be anything from memory, it could be continence, it could be lots of different things. Dementia can affect anyone, but it is much more prevalent within people aged over 65, and that increases the older you get, essentially.
But yeah, Alistair, you work with people with learning disabilities as well, don't you? And
Yeah.
so people with Down syndrome, they can acquire.
Yeah. So one of the so my kind of background was working in hospitals, which is originally more kind of older people. My current team in learning disability services, so people with Down syndrome have a mandatory assessment for dementia when they're 30, and nearly 1 in 2, so half of every person with Down syndrome, if they reach 50, 1 in 2 will have dementia. So just going to think about that not everyone will have, you're going to image stereotype of someone with dementia is kind of an older person, but it can affect anyone, and it can affect younger people as well. And as I said, at the moment, there's currently around 850,000 people in the UK with dementia. That's projected to rise, which obviously have a kind of significant impact on society as a whole, and particularly the care and health system. So you mentioned the true and false questions. It has a huge economic impact, as well as the human cost. And I said it's more than cancer, more than heart disease. And recently it became actually this single biggest killer of people in the UK, overtaking, I think it was heart disease. So 60,000 deaths a year attributed to it. And that could be more as well. That's only kind of known, confirmed. And there's a huge amount of unpaid care roles. You think of family members that you might have looked after or helped look after, or you have grandparents that looked after their partners, etc. There's a huge amount of people, nearly 700,000 that we know of, that are providing huge amounts of care, which in reality is billions worth of kind of support if you put that into kind of managed care scenarios.
I think then, and this is a debate that rages on really across adult social care per se, but I think organisations who advocate for carers, such as Alzheimer's Society or even Age UK, would say very clearly that, and as I think you all know as well, how it can feel very undervalued these unpaid carers, etc., who are doing this essential work. So
Yeah.
maybe some of the social work role is as much as possible to link in carers to whatever support services they can.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit around the kind of assessment process, the kind of reality for particularly kind of statutory social work interventions with these people. You think about that kind of supporting those care roles. The current system, if we took those carers away, would collapse in an instant. So supporting those people, giving them the right kind of support to maintain that care is really important. And that kind of highlights that 2/3 of people with dementia live at home, as opposed to 1/3 are currently in care homes. And I think that might be kind of 24-hour supported living as well, might come under that. But so that's a huge amount of people at home. You think that's 850,000, so maths is terrible, but over 500,000 people who are at home needing support, often with informal carers. Yeah. So it's a big kind of burden on lots of people. Yeah. And yeah, as was mentioned, that's what we know of. There could be as many as 400,000 people in the UK with dementia, and we don't know about it. So again, remember, kind of hidden time bomb in terms of the kind of care and social care, the health sector. So we talked a little bit about kind of causes. So the next section we'll go through kind of, I said there's over 200 types, but some main ones you might come across. But in answer to that kind of question in dementia, what causes it, in terms of Alzheimer's, or they're not really sure yet, and there are other dementias that they are more kind of certain on, like corticals, which we'll come on to. And we're going to talk wide about kind of approaches to use people with dementia. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but we will talk a bit about some kind of methods that will work or potentially work with some people. So in terms of the origin of the word, and we'll talk a bit about kind of ideas of self in this presentation as well, which is sometimes overlooked when you kind of maybe look at more kind of functional. You see person as like just a person who is dementia rather than a person who might have dementia.
Yeah.
And it means departing from the mind is the kind of Latin origin. And that kind of sense of identity and loss of self can be hugely traumatic, let alone the kind of practical sense of someone might be getting lost when they go outside or whatever it might be. That kind of loss of individual self and identity can be really an important factor of the work you might engage with people.
Interesting, really, isn't it? That the word, we use it, dementia, all the time, but of course it comes from, and it was formulated from language and from Latin, and it actually does, when you think about it, it's about loss, and losses, or certainly change, is what is prevalent in people living with dementia.
Yeah. So as I said, everyone will experience it differently, and the signs are always obvious, depending when you're diagnosed. But some kind of common themes are around kind of poor memory of recent events, unable to concentrate, so starting a task, being distracted. So a common one that you might be thinking about when you're working with people is someone who's like making a meal, they kind of forget about it, they can't concentrate, they leave it, that kind of thing. Poor organisation, particularly kind of longer term planning. You need to think about accessing bureaucracy for benefits, all those kind of things. Disorientation of place and self and people you're with. So it might be someone going out, getting lost, not assuring where they are, what they're doing. Kind of repetitive speech. It's quite a common one where you're kind of going over the same topic. It might be 5 minutes later you talk about the same thing. That kind of decision making, again, it links to that kind of longer term planning, not able to kind of weigh up decisions, and we'll come on to mental capacity as well. Also kind of more kind of physical effects. It does affect an individual's mobility, so like increase of falls, not being able to judge distances, confusion over like using a handrail or stuff like that we might take for granted, which also then has a really impact on kind of care support as well, and management of that risk. Again, that kind of handling money comes around, that kind of planning, decision making, counting, those kind of things as well. And sometimes underestimated as well the change in personality or mood, or people who might never been aggressive in their life before suddenly change because as parts of their brain literally break down, certain elements of their personality will change, might become more aggressive, or they might become less aggressive. There's no kind of single thing that will change. And going back to that trauma, there's depression is a really common side effect of dementia, for want of a better word, that it is a loss. Your life is changing. It's probably getting worse for a lot of people, and the impact on that can have a real kind of psychological effect, as well as the physical kind of dementia impact.
And I know you're going to talk about this in the next slide, Alistair, but I can remember certainly working with people living with dementia, how it is difficult, and it's certainly not obvious that these are indicators of dementia, because there can be other issues going on, UTI, etc., or any other sort of change. But it's just. I think the thing here is about getting a proper diagnosis, and it's about, these are indicators of which then to sort of maybe begin the process of looking at, well, is this person entering into those realms, the realms of depression, of dementia?
Yeah, and this is Carl was saying, so often other things get mistaken for it. So in your practice, you can think about things that might impair memory and actually have quite similar effects, but might not actually be dementia. Was thinking about, if you are not certain, recommending kind of diagnosis. So each area will have their own different diagnostic process. It might be the GP, if it's really obvious, can do it. Most places will have something called a memory clinic or variations of. But often, kind of generally getting older, there will be a minor, often impact on kind of short-term memory, things like that. Depression is a big one, and actually in the memory clinic in Hackney, there's been a recent diagnosis of depression. They won't actually assess whether someone has dementia or not for 6 months, because the impacts like low mood, short-term memory loss, confusion, disorientation, all those things can be related to really severe depression. And a really big one, particularly of older people, is around delirium, which can be often caused by urinary tract infections, urine infections, which can have a real impact on a very similar kind of dementia-style presentation. And you think that's actually treated, that person go back to normal, quotation marks, kind of after that.
Okay, so we wanted to sort of give a sort of lens, really, although clearly you can't experience what someone's living with dementia, what that is like, but just to, got some pictures here around how people living with dementia, how this can manifest and how it can affect that individual. So, for example, here, these are some pictures that came from the Alzheimer's Society, and it's this individual living with dementia saw the mirror in the bathroom entrance, but it caused them to leave, thinking it was occupied, when it was actually, they were seeing their own reflection. So weren't able to interpret or discern that because of the disease. And here a lady says there's a mouse in the bin. But again, there you can see that that's how they're seeing this, the stopper, really. But again, just to give a sense of how it can cause this confusion. Another one here, this is in a dementia unit, and the pond was discerned to be within that nice little front room stroke lounge, and the person thought that there were goldfish and lilies there. And again, we come in and people not living with dementia will notice that immediately, but see how that brings out that confusion. And here, this lift looked like a corridor going on to somewhere else. So again, just giving a sense of how this can manifest. And the final one, this floor looking slippery, wet, or just confusing in itself. And
I would recommend as well, a lot of places will do training where you kind of and it's obviously impossible to really truly experience what it's like to have dementia, but you put on suits that kind of weigh you down, your vision can be impaired to make it kind of more blurry. That can be really good to actually get a bit of insight into how someone might be experiencing it. And actually, when you're working with someone, also kind of think about the environment, which is really kind of important. And actually, if you're trying to keep someone at home or independent, kind of think about how their home environment in particular
yes,
can be improved.
Can be, and how it can be disarming for individuals, and how they may interpret things differently. So, wanted to take just a little bit of time now and to just to explore some of the common types of dementia which are prevalent. But just as Alistair said, there's over 200 of them. But some of the ones which are more prevalent as such, and that we and would come across possibly, and what you may do as workers or have done as well. So, I think one which is probably the most common one, if you were to do a poll, would be the Alzheimer's disease. Generally, people, which would be one of the most common. Pauline is saying, this is very interesting. I never knew these additional side effects of dementia. No, thank you, Pauline. It is very wide ranging, and the sort of signs and symptoms can be very varied indeed. So with Alzheimer's disease, in the main, it's the most common, and it changes the brain structure and leads to the death of brain cells. Generally, they talk about plaques in the brain and how this can disrupt the brain's usual activity. The disease actually manifests itself, and they also have a shortage of chemicals involved in the transition of messages within the brain. So it can be quite a profound change for that individual, and it can take, it'd be in shorter times, or it can be rapid as well, dependent on the individual. There's no set sort of way in which it will manifest. And the next one, vascular dementia. So another common form of dementia, triggered by blockages to the blood vessels, to the vascular system, sometimes called like little mini strokes, if you like, or infarcts. And this is when there's not enough blood or oxygen that reach the nerve cells, so they die. And the areas of the brain tissue also will have died. So vascular dementia is also called multi-infarct dementia as well, which is how I actually knew it, and used to term it. But of course, it's the same as vascular dementia. And again, it can, as a series of strokes that result from other health problems as well, can be what makes it problematic, such as high blood pressures, situations, etc. So again, very alarming for the individual when this begins to take hold and take grip. And the next one, frontotemporal dementia and PICS. The damage is usually focused on the front part of the brain, and personality and behavior are initially more affected than memory. So you can see how it is. It takes time, most certainly, and it takes more analysis, etc., in order to really hone in and to get a sense of that the dementia is prevalent to begin with, but what type as well, because of the way in which it can manifest for the individual. And the next one, the dementia with Lewy bodies, another common form of dementia, and can affect as many as 1 in 10 people, and appears in the neurons which are breaking down within the brain. And in the brain, that when Lewy bodies are in deep regions of the brain that affect control and movement, they cause Parkinson's. and possibly will know how the effects of Parkinson's on an individual and how that can really change how a person actually can function. Have you had any experience with that, Alistair?
Yeah, so one thing that Lewy body dementia can impact is hallucinations. So it can actually affect people with really kind of quite real hallucinations. It is relatively treatable, so you can kind of control those, but it can be really distressing for people, and often compared to say like Alzheimer's, we have the kind of the more stereotypical memory loss and things like, this does happen with Lewy body dementia. Often these kind of effects can happen first. So just going to again think about that kind of the impact on the individual can be quite distressing. They're having really realistic hallucinations. Had someone who lived near the overground and they could see the train coming in their flat every day. Obviously, it was pretty upsetting for them.
Right. Very profound, really, to work with this. And finally, just in terms of the main dementias, the main diseases, Korsakoff syndrome, which again you may certainly have come across, which is a brain disorder that's usually associated with heavy drinking and drug abuse over a long period. And so, although this is not strictly dementia, people with the condition do experience short-term memory loss and through this excessive lifestyle, and can then go on to develop vascular dementia or Alzheimer's. So, of course, in terms of how we are and in terms of being in social work practice and in profession, when we work with individuals who are presupposed to drinking or have alcohol issues and problems, we try to be preventative in many ways in the way in which we work. And of course, we don't want service users, clients, so society and people to enter into go into this vascular dementia or Alzheimer's. So, but it is one of the types of dementias that can be reversed, unlike the others. And in the main, the person needs to be without alcohol or drugs for 6 weeks for that process to begin. But of course, that person, you have to work with that person for them to come into the pre-contemplative stage and then to go into the actual action stages as well. But of course, I would see that's very much as part of social work and social work practice and the roles that we take on board.
So as Carl said, most types of dementia are not curable. I mean, Korsakoff is an interesting one because I think I'm not medically trained, so please don't quote me on this, but I've done a link to NHS treatments. Korsakoff is around essentially the alcohol and drugs destroy vitamins that are part of the brain development. So that's kind of where it comes about from. So actually by that kind of treatment, you can reverse it if the person stops drinking. Also, Korsakoff can be a particularly complex group of people to work with, both often people with substance misuse problems, chaotic lifestyles, potential criminal behaviour, things like that. So it can be quite a complex cohort to work with. But as I said, most dementias are not curable. Some can have treatment available. So there are some Alzheimer's medication, although it's very limited in its kind of impact, but it can slow it down a little bit. And same with vascular dementia, they can treat underlying issues because essentially it's around those stroke risks. That's where that kind of prevention thing, I think, is where social care can come in really importantly, is that preventative thing. So if you can work with someone who is poorly managing their diabetes, is smoking, is drinking, if you kind of try to address those issues earlier, it reduces the risk of those developing. And obviously, as you mentioned earlier, that it always is really important to reinforce that check with medical staff that people have had proper checks around this. We don't just assume it's dementia, because it could be other things that have impacts that are similar, that if you treat those, and especially, you can have other risks if you don't treat those. One of the big things with people, particularly with kind of challenging behaviours, often people will be locked away and put on quite strong antipsychotics, which is pretty much not done anymore, particularly in the last 10 years, because the impact of the kind of side effects of most antipsychotics are quite harsh, to put it mildly. And even people with dementia, there's kind of huge risk factors. They are still used very occasionally where there's kind of really distressing behaviours, and it can be in someone's best interest if they're experiencing such kind of suffering that actually the risks of that are eliminated. But we shouldn't be kind of looking at controlling and essentially kind of sedating people due to their behaviours. And the most effective treatments that have been identified so far are kind of social and therapeutic interventions. So reminiscence work or life story work in a more kind of therapeutic style. So that's essentially remembering childhood, remembering going through photos of family members, and remembering kind of where someone's kind of got to. But the most important thing is social stimulation. So isolation is directly linked to dementia. I don't know what the exact kind of causes are, but actually having regular contact with people, having things to do, and it really doesn't matter what those things are, to be honest, but having kind of regular social interaction and meaning in your life is really important and can prevent dementia and also can help prevent its deterioration. So into your work as well, there's really strong evidence based around that. If you think about trying to access funding for social support, Age UK have done a huge study on this as well, and the Alzheimer's Society has a lot.
Yes, and we're going to talk more about social and therapeutic interventions as we go along, but there's no panacea, is there? There's no cure as such, even though I've read, and we've all read really around in articles, etc., and certainly in newspapers around these new drugs, etc., that have come along. It still seems to be one of these diseases, one that's elusive up to this point anyway, around when it coming from a medical perspective or that medical model. There's nothing there as such.
Yeah.
Although, as you said, Alistair, rightfully so, maybe some that can sort of help to slow it down a little bit, maybe. Okay. So we wanted to lead on now to take more of a kind of a sociological perspective at this point in terms of how dementia is viewed in society, and with the premise of thinking, well, where are we though going to come in and approach working with people living with dementia from our social work perspectives, considering and thinking about the value base of which social work is located, where that comes from. And I think, and maybe would you agree or disagree with these, that the public view of people living with dementia is that it's quite a tragedy and people are suffering. It's almost like a living death, or even worse than death, and then nothing can be done. Quite a focus on it being something which is disastrous as well as traumatic for the individual. But I think we're here to argue, am I right, Alistair? We're here to argue that we don't see that social work would take that approach or should take that approach. I think, as you were rightfully saying, around the different kind of social perspectives that we can take can in fact have and improve the quality of the lives of people living with dementia. Because what would be interesting to know is, well, what do people with dementia say? How do they view their illness, etc., as well? And where we come in terms of enabling that person. You know, we talk, and I know we had a webinar around strength-based models, didn't we, a few months ago, and empowerment, etc. And well, where does that fit in when work with people with dementia? So we're going to launch ourselves into that in the next part of this webinar. But we would just like to, in response to that question around, well, what do people with dementia say? We've got a video now that we're going to play, and I think it's quite as we say, the brutally honest video around how this disease, how dementia can impact on people and on their lives, etc., as well as the stigma that it causes and how it affects people's social location or their social identity, who they are. But also, I think it gives an insight. This is why we chose it. It gives a bit of an insight into how people are experiencing living with dementia. So do have a look at this, and we'll come back to you after that to progress on.
What does it feel like to live with dementia? The experience of living with dementia is often a challenging one. The more people's emotions and perspectives are understood, the better they can be supported. This film introduces 4 people who are able to share their insights on living with advancing dementia, insights that were filmed over time and which were not always easily communicated.
I wake up and I feel afraid to get out. What am I going to face today? What's going to go wrong? Because I've always got this thing in my, well, often get this thing in my mind to say, you've done something, you've broken something, you've lost something, you aren't any good to anybody, why are you here? And I get that a lot.
Oh, it's awful. You get to the stage where you don't want to talk to people in case you repeat yourself.
I couldn't go outside and go to a shop or something. I died. Well, I couldn't do it.
I used to do it all right one time. But it seems to get a bit harder and harder every year. You end up with things like this.
Well, you don't feel as if you're in the world. At least I didn't. I didn't feel as if I was part of the world.
Yeah, you used to have fun.
Makes you feel defeated. What good am I in this world? I'm doing nothing. I'm going to sit down here and be fed and sleep and washed and like an animal.
Let me live.
Barry has lived with dementia for more than 15 years. He's aware of the changes within his life and is still both able to articulate this and, importantly, express how he feels about it.
Well, when I came home last night and I went out and she said she wanted a cup of tea, I said, well, I'll make that 1 minute. So I went out and made the tea, but I couldn't remember which cupboard was which. Couldn't remember where the jam goes, where the sugar goes, where's the milk, where's that. And I was out like this for a minute, so this is my kitchen. I used to manage butcher shops, I used to run a care home. I used to drive all over the country giving lectures on meat. Here I am, I can't make a cup of tea.
Olive, who has lived in a care home for 2 years, describes her feelings about dementia.
Awful. It's terrible. Because you're hurting the people you love most. Dementia. You really are. It makes you feel very guilty.
Bob has received full-time care for 2 years. He talks about how dementia has changed his life.
In the word, concentration. I can't seem to concentrate on one thing for very long. I don't think you realise how it hits you.
Bob's symptoms include hallucinations and mistaken beliefs, which his wife Sally explains.
When he gets hallucinations, they're extremely real to him. He sees things that aren't actually happening. We've had problems where his room's been on fire and he's had to get out.
Shortly before Bob moved into a care home, there were 2 occasions when he found himself on the roof of his house.
I went twice. I got up on a roof, walked across the roof of a house. I don't know what made me do it. That's the difficult part. You can't explain it. and says it happened and you did it. 1 o'clock in the morning. It's quite frightening.
Judy was diagnosed with dementia 11 years ago. She experiences problems with visual perception and is often disorientated.
Where am I here? I know who I am.
Right.
I've got that one down.
Okay. Where are you here?
Yeah, no, where place is this place?
Judy's daughter Karen knows her mother so well that she understands Judy's needs and feelings even when Judy can't find the words.
She wants to express herself in ways that she just can't anymore. She wants to do things that she just can't do anymore. But because she still has a little bit of insight, it makes it really difficult because she still knows the things she wants to do, but she just can't do them.
Why are you sad, Mum?
Oh, looking back.
Looking back?
Yeah.
Why does it make you sad looking back?
Oh, I don't know. Probably I should have done other things. You can't do anything about it. That's the thing.
People can feel powerless in the face of dementia.
Well, it's like a silent illness, isn't it? It's the sort of thing that creeps up on you. Yeah, there is a feeling of loneliness.
But dementia stole in. I had no understanding that there was coming this thing that was going to attack my mind. I had no idea that anything could attack my mind, if you know what I mean. Other people, yes, but not me. It didn't occur to happen to me. And it's just like a persistent spy, almost. Someone who is not recognizable. But his effects are, what he leaves behind him and what he's implanted are noticeable.
Dementia is sometimes portrayed as taking away a person's identity. Judy was asked if she feels this is true for her.
Oh, it doesn't. You are what you are with that. Well, with me, I'll be the same. Exactly the same. No, I'm sorry, it's still me. It's still me. I'm saying.
It's horrible because she was so young, being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but then, you know, that bits of her do still shine through, and she still is my mum.
Barry is also clear on this point.
Yeah, I'm a man, it's me, and I am me. I'm my wife's husband, I'm my son's dad, and it seems to me that most people, oh, she got dementia. That's sort of like a full stop. End the sentence, end the discussion. She's got dementia, or he's senile.
Supportive relationships with families, friends and professional carers play a key role in helping people with dementia live well.
They're very caring, and I get big hugs from my husband and my children, and that's all right, Mum, you forgot something, that's all. Doesn't matter. Here we are, and it's all sorted out again.
Well, if you to stay here and help me, and just to be.
Always been friends as well.
Yeah, well, friends before the romance, so I think then you do stay in a loving relationship because the depth is there, isn't it? But he's still the Bob I fell in love with, and I still love. You know, he's still that person underneath everything.
For people with dementia, as with any individuals, empathy and support can help to retain their sense of identity, as well as enhance their well-being and quality of life.
If I could say one thing to somebody who's got dementia or a carer, it would be probably hang on in there, because they really do need you and they have feelings and totally understand what you're saying. And one thing, if I walk into the room and Mum can't see me, she hears my voice within a split second. If I say hello to somebody, she knows that I'm there, and it means so much to them. Hello.
So there's quite an interesting video there that kind of highlights some of the kind of human element of dementia, not kind of just thinking of people as kind of group of symptoms, that they are still human, they still have feelings and thoughts and identity as well.
Yes. And ostensibly, I think we can see that people with dementia can still be alert and they can have an awareness of their condition. But it's important to know that people with advancing dementia, to support them to maintain their own identity or who they are. Because although dementia causes loss of some abilities, people's feelings remain intact. That we can say that quite conclusively. And it's essential to empathize with people's emotions. In other words, we speak about a lot in social work around person-centered approaches, and we're going to speak more around that. But having that empathy, coming from a place of congruence, or as Carl Rogers would say, no matter who you are, we would look to take a humanist approach and to help people to self-actualize. And to help them to, as we said here again, for people's feelings to be acknowledged and to remain intact. But caring and supporting relationships do help people to cope with the difficult experience of living with advancing dementia. Research has shown that, and social model perspectives as well can be very much a strong platform with which to enable that. Because if we don't, and as a profession and as social workers, if we don't take on board that unique identity of the person and acknowledge that they have lost maybe some abilities, or we're promoting the abilities that they do have, the strength-based models.
Exactly, yeah.
That are prevalent, that many people speak about, empowerment. Dennis Saleeby writes around that empowerment model, for example. How if we're not coming from that perspective, then we distance ourselves from the individual, and moreover, and more importantly, we ignore their potential, what it is that they can do, and what it is that they're able to do. In other words, we'll be coming from almost like a palliative care lens and thinking, well, this is already the end of life's journey, where it might not necessarily be. Because health, and the reality is health is a multifaceted, and many factors influence ill health. But of course, many factors help to maintain good health as well. And we would say that, again, coming very much from that model of empowerment and taking account who that person is and where they are and where their strengths are, is key to good practice.
So I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of reality for social workers or social care professionals working with people who have dementia. And so from a social work perspective, our registered professionals, we have duties, and there's some of the things that will relate to people with dementia, protect their rights, promote choice and trust, and kind of maintaining working relationships, keep people safe from harm, and allow people to take risks, which is a really important thing I wanted to focus on. So you think about your Social Work England registration as it is now, the professional capabilities framework, the knowledge and skills statements, KSF standards. This all kind of links to, as well as the statutory legal side as well, which we'll have a little look at later as well, about your kind of responsibilities.
duty of care as well is very much ingrained in social values, is it not?
Right.
And our values are, why do they matter? I know they involve we're engaged in complex interactions with members of a number of disadvantaged groups in the profession. And when people are most vulnerable and when they're at their most in need. So they are important because they give us the framework with which we are going to intervene, but also our values enable us to explore our actions, or what influences our actions and where we're coming from. And so, yes, duty of care is important, and as I think you're saying, Alistair, but it's important to link that very much to the value base of our profession that comes from now Social Work England and from BASWA and the 5 ethical domains that they purport we should work towards.
So that kind of very practical side of things as well, when you actually are physically seeing someone, and the reality of social work practice, a lot of the focus is on risk. And risk assessment is a key part of social work assessment. I won't go into too much detail about what risk assessment is, but that's kind of a whole separate presentation of itself. But when you're working with people with dementia, something you kind of think about, and as I'd take an example about the Care Act and concepts of well-being, which we can look at a bit as well. I think a really important element of this that sometimes we have a very risk-averse approach, where we want to talk about antipsychotics, for example, before. It's about keeping people safe, quotation marks, and kind of locked up and eliminate all risk. And you think about your own lives, we can't eliminate risk. Crossing the road is a risk. If you have a couple too many wines of an evening is a risk. We all make decisions that our lives have an element of risk in them. Life is a risk, so what the NHS and a lot of kind of policy and guidance supports this. So the NHS guidance was about 10 years old now. Nothing ventured, nothing gained is about keeping people at home if possible, about giving them the opportunity to take risks in a safest way as possible, and actually not just, keeping safe above everything else. Let's go to jump. So the bottom, the court protection judgment. The bottom there, which is the court protection, for those who don't know, the court around mental capacity, where someone might lack the ability to make decisions about their care or accommodation or things like that. There's a quote from the judge: is what good is it making someone safer if it merely makes them miserable? And this is around someone who still had quite a lot of insight into their condition, but they were still spending quite a lot of risky behaviours, as we'd kind of label it, cooking, was setting things on fire and various other bits and pieces. And the local authority wanted to put the person in a care home, and that person didn't want it. And the judgment from the court was, obviously they have a duty to the public, but actually this is clearly what the person wants. What is the point of making them miserable just so they are, quotation marks, safe? So in your kind of practice, and there's a financial element to this as well, but think about keeping people at home as much as possible. And you're kind of thinking of other options before you have to go down the 24-hour care route, whether that be care home, supported living, whatever it is as well. Because obviously a lot of people with dementia, if you're taking people out of their environment that they know, that is often going to worsen their ability to cope. And that, again, all of these are kind of generalizations, but if you can keep people at home, that's generally the best option. And then the thing in your practice, think about what can be done. So really obvious things like labeling cupboards, write the word kettle on something, or there's lots of kind of communication tools where you can use pictures to talk about moods. You can use assistive technology. So often what we use is kind of teddy care. It's called in Hackney, but every local authority will have some alarm system where if there is an emergency, various different ways you can kind of flag that. And kind of more trying to be a bit more flexible around home care. Often there's kind of a dollop to care approach, i.e. you have here's your number of calls a day, and actually think about how you can, there's a carer, how can you be more kind of flexible with that home care to keep people at home and eliminate that risk as well.
I think those are some really good strategies, actually, sort of practical things that you can do as well. And So just in terms of risk, and when you're looking at risk, in terms of taking that multidisciplinary approach as well, that is critical.
Very much so, as I'm going to put on there. But you want to involve as many people around that decision making as kind of possible. So obvious ones are, family, relatives, the person themselves, obviously, but also where you might have, doctors, GP, there's a psychiatrist involved, occupational therapy around the environment and any adaptations might reduce that risk. We talked about high risk of falls and things like that. And that kind of joint decision making around risk is kind of where things have gone wrong in the past, and safeguarding adults reviews is actually what people want to see is where that kind of decision making is coming from, that we can't get everything perfect all of the time, or something bad might happen. And as we talked about, it's not, it doesn't have to be perfect all the time. But having that kind of logic around decision making and joined up decision making is quite important.
And I think, just to say finally, that assistive technology you're speaking of as well can really help with cognitive stimulation, because it kind of just gives the trigger, and then that person remembers and then can continue with what they used to do really as much as possible.
An example of that could be there's door alarms that we use in Hackney that if someone's not supposed to be going out, it will literally say, can you go back into your room, or you can have we use the medication prompts and things as well. So it's used quite a lot in quite creative ways. And again, I won't kind of labour too much on this point, because the whole mental capacity side applies to obviously everyone. And if there's any kind of impairment of the brain or mind functioning, it will be relevant. But something to really kind of just remember when you're working with people with dementia in practical steps: are we assessing it properly? Are we considering it? And that goes both ways. Are we just you don't want to kind of just let someone get on with something without there's real concerns, without kind of properly assessing their ability to understand what that decision is. Also, vice versa, we don't want to take away someone's ability to choose without properly assessing that. And that's obviously a legal duty as well. And although they are increasing, and it's I mentioned the DOLS, deprivation of liberty safeguards there. So that's changing to liberty protection safeguards very soon. But there is legal recourse that we should consider if we are depriving someone their liberty, preventing them from leaving, constant supervision or restraint. Something to kind of consider in your kind of practical work, and something to think about with providers as well, and trying to limit that restraint and deprivation as much as possible. So again, if we're doing this in kind of a face-to-face setting, I kind of give these two case studies of genuine people I've worked with the last couple of years, and ask what people would do with them. But I thought it was interesting too, and I won't kind of read them out, you can read them yourselves, but two interesting cases that have been quite complex work and kind of representative of some of the things we can face when we're working with people with dementia, and some of the complexities around that. And, it's all well and good saying, take into account individual choice, prevent restrictions where possible, but you're facing someone, for example, Mr. X up there, where he is essentially sexually assaulting people, he's refusing all support around kind of continence care, that he was unable to speak. And it's a really interesting case worked with, where he was a priest and he would only speak in Latin, which was quite hard to find an interpreter for, I must admit.
Right, yes.
But actually, sometimes we do need to take, he unfortunately ended up in a specialist dementia mental health unit because of the complexity of his needs. But that can be okay at times, but it needs to be the most extreme cases. We need to exhaust all options first. And we spent a lot of time kind of working with his family and other providers to try kind of keep him at least in kind of a normal care home setting, if not at home. And then and that kind of highlights where actually he was kind of easier in the sense that you knew he lacked understanding around the decisions around his care and accommodation. Where someone like Mrs. Y, for example, a real case, who was maybe at the earliest stages of dementia, but could communicate really clearly, but actually, and kind of highlighting some of the complexities around assessing capacity I was talking about, where if you ask them, how do you manage your money? They would go, I need to go to the bank. I need to pay that bill. But then if you take the kind of practical or kind of executive capacity side of it, if you went back next week, they wouldn't have done that. And they would do things like, if I asked, do you remember what we talked about last week? It's like, I'm not an idiot. I know what I talked about last week, but they wouldn't say what they talked about. And it took a long time, again, ended up having to go down the court protection route around trying to make sure that we ended up shutting off this person's cooker due to fire risks and managing the person's money. But we did keep her at home. So kind of balance of those, not, in terms of express wishes, couldn't do everything, but we still managed to keep that person at home for much longer with that kind of support.
And with Mrs. Y, and saying that she really hated social services intervention, in terms of breaking that down, was it like small conversations you were having with her and that relationship-based social work approach that Gillian Rouche, etc., would speak about?
Yeah, very much so. And it required persistence. It required using other people who she did trust. There was a housing support worker she got on with and known for years. And that can sometimes be difficult. And it's sometimes in a very care management, case management focused world, review targets being difficult. But it's easy putting into one paragraph, but that kind of took 6-7 months of work of going regularly, kind of trying to break down, sometimes being having the door shut in your face, other times having those conversations. It's very time intensive, and this work can be quite time intensive. And that's, for me, is that kind of relationship work is social work for me, and actually what it should be. But this highlights that you're not always going to see a really obvious case that you know exactly what to do with. There will be complexities where it requires a kind of balance of probability approach, time investment, building those relationships with the person, but also the rest of their networks, to try kind of getting in and try get somewhere with it. And as I said, in cases where the law is there also to protect us as professionals, that where we took over the person's finances through a court protection order, where it got to the stage where we know that we feel that person doesn't understand that and it's too high risk. As long as it's the least restrictive option we have, we can still have that slightly more coercive side of practice if we need to. Obviously, that should be an absolute last resort.
I think that comes back to what the first slides were then, that was speaking around in terms of what is social work about. If it's not about engaging in relationships, and if it's not about, as you said, having those conversations and engaging with that person, showing that you're interested in them, that they are actually they're important, and what would that person want in terms of a relational approach? They would want to feel that someone cares about me and has my interests at heart, and that will take time, of course, as you will go along. But the actual reward for that, which is in terms of us in social work, is that we want to improve and to have an effect on the lives of people, can be very profound, I would say.
Just always want to briefly kind of highlight that kind of theory that people would work, theory that still kind of applies to these people we work with, and some of the differences between anti-discriminatory practice and anti-oppressive practice for more experienced practitioners, probably taking you back to university courses. So anti-discriminatory practice around essentially making sure that people are kind of treated equally, where there might be groups, whether that may be BAME or LGBTQ+, or whoever it might be, that we're not making kind of value judgments, or trying to at least be aware of the value judgments that might be within us to make sure that people are treated fairly. And obviously that applies to people with dementia as well, that you're not kind of labelling, you're not taking them as a broad, like everyone is the same as dementia. And where anti-oppressive practice is around more challenging kind of those structures around oppression or discrimination. So whether it be the economic side potentially of, again, in this case, dementia, where the bureaucracy is set up around benefits. If you think about universal credit, things like that, how difficult that might be for someone with dementia to access. So kind of think about more kind of structural kind of views and society ideas, and trying to challenge that as much as possible within your practice.
Good point. I think they really impact as well on the lives.
So, yeah, exactly. So in terms of that, as we're thinking about where, of course, you have the care activity in an adult setting around the kind of needs you're assessing, but taking into account that kind of social cultural context that might be an impact on that kind of support you provide. And it could be anything from making sure that I had a really interesting case, not dementia, but it demonstrates this around where is a woman Black Caribbean origin, and it's very much, you have your 45 minutes of personal care in the morning, but she wanted once a week to have a bit longer, so her hair could be put into cornrows, and that kind of thing is where, from a white hair perspective, it sounds silly, but you do your wash, that's dry it, you're fine. And actually taking into account those kind of differences and kind of structures of that whole care system is set up to have, this is how long it takes to do personal care. But obviously that isn't a person-centered way of working, and thinking about those intersectional approaches you put there, about thinking about the kind of differences and kind of values that kind of impact on our practice.
And so, taking on board what you're saying there, Alistair, we're going to look at another video now, which is looking at working with how people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic origins, which is expected to rise significantly, and to consider and to think about intersectional approaches as well, as you were saying, and that with people that you're working with, nobody is just one thing. We can label people. Society labels people. Through taking an intersectional approach, we break that down. We see people as a rainbow, or as a color of things, because we all have different sides to ourselves. We all have different perspectives of who we are. So if we think about it, next slide, in terms of, if we're looking at the person with dementia, is dementia all that they're about? Is that who they are? Is that the label we're giving them? Or are they a person with many different facets and sides to their personality and who they are, who is with dementia? I think you can see there, and visually we have it there, that it's about perspective, it's about lens. So in that context, this next film will be looking at people from BAME communities, and some of the cultural elements within that for us to consider and think about and to be aware of within social work and social work practice, and how important it is if we really are interested in the person in small with dementia, and if we're going to work in that context.
Well, this film is about what happens when a family tries to come to terms with somebody who's starting to experience the early symptoms of dementia. It's not just about the person who's living with dementia themselves, it's about the impact on the whole family. I think it's going to be particularly useful across the public sector, for example, to help people generally who may be experiencing working with people with dementia, even if they're not working in dementia services. This film was made to raise awareness for the African Caribbean community in particular about an illness that often they tend to think maybe doesn't impact much on them as a community. I want people to learn from this film that you need to talk about these issues. You need to be able, as families, and I think wider than that, with friends and colleagues, to talk about these concerns, to think about how you might begin to get some help and support with the worries. Not to close down conversation because it's a stigmatised issue, not to close down conversation because black people don't talk about being ill, which is an important, difficult barrier, particularly in dementia, in terms of people getting help. And to feel that there is support out there, there is information about there, it is for them, and they can get access and help. It's a great film. It's a great portrayal of an ordinary family coming to terms with something that's very, very difficult, and some of the struggle that people go through, and begin to look for some help and support.
Hey, Mum. Mum? What are you doing?
Nothing. Just thinking.
Cup of tea? Mum? I'll make you one anyway. What's up, Mum?
Damn thing. I can't get it to work.
Calm down. Let me have it. It would help if it was the right way around. Ta-da! Surely not more strictly. I don't know how you watch this stuff.
Elliot's father couldn't get enough of me curry goat. That's why he married me.
Well, Elliot certainly didn't marry me for my cooking.
Oh, Denise, can you leave the table, my sweet? Donovan will soon be here.
Anything I can do to help?
Why did Donovan put this so to last? Lord have mercy, he's always doing this.
You're silly, Nanny.
Oh, thank you, darling.
Hi, Mum.
Just checking the time you're picking me up for church.
As usual, Mum. 11:30. Everything all right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, see you soon. Love you.
See you then.
What's his name?
I forget.
Hi, Mum.
Hi, Elliot. Just checking what time you're picking me up for church.
As I said, Mum, 11:30. Are you all right, Mum?
Of course.
Sure?
Silly child.
See you then.
What's that about?
I'm not sure. Mum?
sitting there all by yourself. I was starting to worry about you. Sister Patience, are you okay?
Oh, fine, just fine. As much as can be expected at my age.
Oh, don't be soft, girl. You're still a spring chicken, just like myself. How is that sweet little thing of a granddaughter of yours? She must be at school now, mustn't she?
She'd just be 18 months old. Sleeps like a dream.
Funny. Looks like your friend Mrs. Clark.
No.
Yes, she does.
Look, Pearl got a bit.
Look at her. She looks...
Oh, Elliot,
Jesus.
watch my rug. It'll be stained now. Go and get the stain remover quickly before the stain dries.
All right, Mum. What? Mum? Why are there tins and tins of corned beef underneath the sink?
I don't know what you're talking about. It's nothing to do with me. Must be Chantel playing a game on me.
Mum.
You know how the child like to play her games?
Mum.
Where is the stain remover? Move yourself, boy. I'll get it myself.
Mum.
Elliot?
Yes, Mum?
Bless the table, please.
For what we're about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Mum. You've outdone yourself. Oh. Quick, Denise, the plant's in.
Imagine if we hadn't been there. She could have...
But we were there.
And what if it's more serious?
It's just her age. She's just not as fast on her feet as she used to be.
Babe, you've got to get her checked out. We can't just ignore the fact that something really serious is going on.
Denise, just leave it, all right? Just leave it.
Donovan!
Well, with your mother's recent behaviour and high blood pressure, I'm concerned that this could be more than just ageing.
What does all that mean?
I'd like to refer you to a memory clinic. We won't know for sure until we've done some more tests, but there is a possibility that this could be early stage dementia.
What? Say that again.
I understand your shock, but the good thing is that you both came to see us now.
It's a long time since you walked through here. Yep. This is it. Mama, you'll be okay. Trust me. I'll be right here. All right? Come, let's go.
You can see there the importance, really, of starting to talk about cultural sensitivities, and particularly with families that may be reluctant to come forward and talk about concerns. I think what we're doing there, we're encouraging you as professionals to try and break down barriers, really, where this is the situation. And sometimes in Black and minority ethnic communities, they will view dementia as something which can be something which is a stigmatized issue. Of course, that can happen in all communities, but research is showing, particularly with South Asian communities, where the disease is seen as something which is it can be very stigmatized, as I was saying, and so it's important to support and to help families to really to help to come to terms with this issue, and to, as much as possible, to engage in that cultural competency that will help to really bring the best support to an individual. Because as we know, and as we lead on now to think about different models, the biomedical model, for example, which is very much predisposed to working towards medical and biological theories. We're arguing here very profoundly, well, that would have its place, and we will, Alistair will speak a little bit more about that, but it's not the only way forward. Next slide. So, and in fact, if we do think about and we only engage in a medical approach, then it leaves no room within its framework to really address some of the psychological, behavioral, and all the other issues which are prevalent for that person living with dementia in a complete and holistic way. It's not the only way forward. And even though the medical model, and I think this is just to remind you that it comes in with the fact that dementia should be fixed or changed by medical or other treatments. The medical model is, and it's very much understood as in terms of pathology, etc. However, viewing this through the biomedical lens, focusing exclusively on disability, ignores strength, as we've been saying through the whole of our presentation to you today.
And kind of getting away from this kind of strict medical model of it is also kind of reflected in the law that supports the work, about the Care Act and concepts of well-being and the eligibility criteria around support and care. It's not about if you have that diagnosis, you get this support. It's about what that person can do, what their strengths are, and you can prevent things getting worse. And they do need support around their kind of holistic environment.
Okay, well, what can you do? I think we spoke about some of that already. We were saying, Alistair, around in terms of looking at assistive technology, for example, or engaging in the storytelling or the life history of individuals.
Yeah, I was just kind of reiterating, we kind of talked about it a bit earlier as well, but is that recognition of the person as a person? And it sounds really obvious, and it can sound a bit vague and woolly, but it's actually not, because if you're working with someone, yes, you have some procedures you need to follow, yes, you might have some targets, whatever it might be, but you as a social worker professional are engaging with a person, often at a difficult time, they might be experiencing significant change, and getting to know them and understand them as a person, and getting them as much as possible to talk about what support they need, what do they want, and what can maintain and promote who they are. And that's where that kind of social model of disability comes in, that you'll kind of think about support. It's not being prescriptive, it's not being didactic. It's like, you can have your care like this is how it works.
Yes.
But it's flexible as much as possible within the confines of your system. So I'm not going to ignore that you have limits in terms of support that can be provided. There are financial constraints. But actually spending time doing that bit of work, trying to get them engaged with the local community if they're not already, supporting those informal carers, those other networks, could be really meaningful for that person, and actually be a lot better support than a carer coming in and out a couple of times a day. Not saying that can't be needed, and often is needed, but just trying to think about that kind of different types of support that recognises that person.
Yes, and very much, as you all know, certainly around the social model of disability, as purported and really promoted by Michael Oliver, and saying that the social model of disability, that dementia is caused by the way society is organised, and therefore we argue very clearly how we agree with that, and in terms of the social work profession, that its function is to have the cause and effect in that realm around society, and what it is that you do from a societal perspective that you can bring to the multidisciplinary team.
And you think we might have heard in the organisation about kind of dementia friendly, this might be kind of around public toilets, more dementia friendly, signage, spaces and environments in public buildings, all those kind of things are about reorganising that society kind of structural sense of, so the person who might have a condition can cope in that world. And it could be basic as ramps and things, that's not too many stairs, stuff like that.
And promoting awareness as well, in terms of your role and what you do, and to enable as much as possible to bring around and to bring the consciousness of what dementia is and how it can prevail. But otherwise, if we don't do that, and if we don't promote that people's lives have not come to an end, they're not in the palliative care situation, as we looked at in the previous slide, otherwise we're then thinking of it as a tragedy. It's a tragedy model, not a social model. It's an illness model, not a model with which we can look to think about and really come back again to core principles of social work. Social justice. This is what social work's about, is it not? Social justice, enabling much of fairness and equality in society as possible. Human rights, really working with those people who are at their most vulnerable times in their lives. But again, of course, it's about social work around that relationship-based social work, forming relationships. These are core tenets, as again, you will all know, which are the foundations and the principles of good interventions in the social work profession. And so just a little bit here around understanding the social model of dementia, and that it's about the social context, and that health is cultural, and biomedicine and medical science is something, but it's not everything. I think we're going to look at it in the next couple of slides, actually, Alistair. But of course, mental health is political. The mental health idiom, the ideology, the discussion, the conversations within that, and different political ideologies can lead to very different healthcare infrastructures. So again, it's about that focus. And I'm not going to go into it, but of course, there's a lot of discussion around the neoliberal marketization of mental health care, Or in other words, well, how does, and that political discussion around, is it society's duty or is it more of a private approach and an individual approach to good dementia care? And that's that rages at the moment.
So again, kind of leading, a lot of this is kind of interrelated. So the biopsychosocial model, which a lot of you may kind of heard, is it really, and its kind of basis is taking into account and not ignoring health conditions, need for treatment, where and medication, wherever it might be in its relevant position, but also acknowledging that that exists within a social and psychological sphere as well, and that it's all interrelated. Like an example, so like with depression, this would apply to dementia. We talked about isolation and dementia and people's ability to kind of function around, if they're not stimulated, they'll get worse. And that is related to their psychological and their social sense. It has a meaningful biological impact and can reduce life expectancies and has a meaningful impact on outcomes, but they're all kind of interrelated and dependent upon each other. So you as social workers, and this is kind of basic social work theory, that when you're working with someone, you need to take these all into account. Depression, if someone's, if you just look at depression on its own, say you're working with someone who's homeless. If they're homeless, they're probably going to be a bit depressed. It's that kind of really basic thing. If you just medicate that, you're not going to solve it. So when working with people with dementia, it's taking into account those, the social impacts of it, that they are less likely to be able to manage their money, and then there's the economic impact of not being able to purchase food they need, do things they want, go on holiday, all things that are really important to us and make us feel good in who we are. So that interrelatedness is kind of really important to take into account.
Okay, and the importance of well-being, as we know, one of the real tenets, which really permeates the Care Act. And I suppose I have a question for you, and I would put out generically, in that, do you believe that you can live with dementia and yet still have good mental health? That debate that rages between mental illness and mental health. And Corey Keyes discusses this very much in his writing, and states that the definition of mental health and mental illness suggests that they are two distinct opposing concepts on the same continuum. So in other words, he would argue that you can indeed have a mental illness, a mental disorder. You could have dementia, but still have good mental health. If you are, as it's saying on this slide here, if the well-being is very much part of the approach that the social worker takes, looking at the well-being of the individual, i.e., how are they functioning as an individual and how are they functioning in the community?
I think as a social work practitioner, this isn't a choice as well. This is the law. This is what the Care Act is. The first section of the Care Act. This is the kind of principles that we should be kind of working towards.
Yes, well, that's a very good point. So in terms of well-being, well, what is that? As an individual, you want self-acceptance, purpose, autonomy, having positive relationships with others as much as possible, environmental mastery, being able to negotiate your own complex environments, and personal growth. And that would be seen as subjective well-being. Whereas if we look at where you are in the next slide, if we think about where we are in society and how we engage with society, we have coherence, acceptance. We're actualized within that and we're evolving positively. But moreover, we're able to contribute and we're able to have integration within that. As much as possible, if you as the social worker can help well-being within this context and within this social functioning context, I think we're working in a positive manner. But we can think about the concept of personhood, i.e., counted as an individual. So to have personhood would be to think about that person as having qualities as much as possible around their insight, around rationality, and around memory. And I put there discuss, because it is a contested, you could say, is a person living with dementia, can they really have insight or rationality or memory? We would argue yes, wouldn't we?
Very much so. In terms of
assumption.
If you think of people and rationality, even though it's a controversial term in itself, but the ability to have insight fluctuates, changes. It's not a static thing, and particularly working with people with more advanced dementia where communication might get more difficult, there will be periods where it will fluctuate and they might have more insight at certain periods. So think about kind of seeing people again multiple times, building those relationships, understand what might be communication and their idea of self for that person as well.
Yes. And that, just moving along, that concept of personhood, Eva Fedekite would talk about that is dependent on sustainability, sustaining the self. So what is meant by self? Well, it's quite again, there's lots of debate around this, and even French philosopher Descartes talks about it being this little man in our head, and that speaks to us in our head, and our homunculus. We've seen about what actually drives us and gives us our sense of self. But I would say that the self is often equated to the idea of who we are as an individual, or sometimes the idea of identity, who we feel we are, who we belong to, that social identity. So you could, and we've put this down here, that self is sometimes, it could be understood by different disciplines. So self could be seen as, from a biological perspective, our self is made up of what we see is what comes from what we believe is residing in the brain. It's our brain that gives us our sense of self. But of course, in dementia, the brain is affected or can be affected profoundly. We talk about the changes in the brain, the plaque that can become very pronounced within that, or if there are different tangles within the brain from a neurological perspective, because the brain is changing. But also we can see it from a different perspective as well, that self is actually about the mind, and what it is in our mind, and how we are viewing and how we are seeing it from a psychological perspective, how we are interpreting ourselves in the world. But also from a social constructivist perspective, you could say that our self is about how we see our narrative, who we are. And you spoke a bit about this, didn't you, Alistair, around our life history. And that's why it's important that the individual that you're working with, to work with them in a way which helps them to narrate their own life story. So that may come through by reminiscence or story sharing. Because the self is around who we believe, who we are in terms of our narration of life.
I think in your practice, where someone dementia, that their narrative self, their role will change and develop, and this is not a static thing. And you might be someone who's helping them adjust to their new narrative that they're currently experiencing with dementia and the impact that will have on them.
A bit like a bookshelf, really. We've got a bookshelf, and sometimes at the point when you're living with dementia, you can only go to the top shelf because you can only remember the most recent things, or sometimes with dementia, they can only remember what's at the bottom of the bookshelf, where there are things which happened many, many, many years ago. But by taking a narrative self approach, you're helping that person to go through the whole bookshelf. Same with the material self. A man's self is the total sum of what he can call his. But is the self, our material things, our possessions, our homes, our houses, where our environments, the things that we have, help us to make up our material self. The same with the relational self. The relationships that we have they formulate who we are in terms of self. And of course, relationships may change. but new relationships may have to form as well, and that helps to form who we are, that identity or that individual that we are. And finally, the embodied self, which is our relationship with our bodies, because that is changing too. So the word I'm using here quite profoundly actually is change. It's not so much about loss, depending on where we're coming from. You haven't lost yourself because your brain has changed, or because psychologically your cognition, you haven't lost self because cognition. It may be if we come from a viewpoint and we come from a lens of change. And Pauline, you're saying that self could be ever changing. I think that's very true.
I really agree with that. I think you kind of view that as how would you view yourself as, say, a 20-year-old as opposed to a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old? Your construction of self at that time is very different to how, and you'll now look back and you'll have an idea of what that person was. But it is a ever-changing thing, exactly as you said, and that is. And so we're working with people who specifically kind of early stages of dementia, that you'll kind of be helping them to kind of navigate that.
Yes. So you raise a very good point there, Pauline, I think it's about what dementia does, of course, it forces change, and it will force some loss. There is some loss of the self, there's no doubt about that. But if we can see it in terms of there may be a loss of daily living skills, for example, but also it could be that we see the self as changing as well. Again, coming in from that lens. Just finally to say, just on the next couple of slides, that we wanted to bring to you just some other ways to think, to approach. There's Corey Keyes, and he speaks about the hedonic domain, rather, and that incorporates satisfaction and interest in life, or the eudynamic domain, which is about the ability to create meaningful relationships, or to self-actualize and to live life in a satisfying way, realization of one's potential. So some theoretical concepts there to think about in terms of the hedonic and the eudynamic domains, which you could work towards, and in terms of a social work intervention, both of those, which Corey Keyes talk about. Because, sorry.
I was going to say, to add to that, in terms of kind of practical intervention, you're working with people, the kind of way I kind of put it is that a lot of it you're kind of assessing, can you go to the toilet? Can you make your own meals? And although that's obviously incredibly important, a big chunk of what we'll be doing, it's not how I view myself, is the fact that I can go to the toilet functionally. There's a huge kind of multiple facets that make up who I am, and interests and satisfactions that, that excites me, that kind of gets me up in the morning, all that kind of stuff, that you can sometimes get lost if we're having a really kind of practical functional assessment of someone, and we ignore like those domains or those concepts of self. So something's going to take away in a kind of very practical sense when you're working with people, of that idea of who they are.
When we work in this manner, what we then are doing, if we're addressing hedonic and eudynamic, if we're looking at well-being, if we're taking on board those concepts, then we are looking and working in a way in helping the person living with dementia to flourish. And in terms of flourishing, that occurs when we bound and frame naturally coexisting energies. So coming from a spiritual perspective, as you were speaking about, the biopsychosocial spiritual elements. And we embrace and we understand that we are coming and we are working with that person as unique. And we're looking to enable them to really maximize their potential.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you. We're doing a shake hands. I like that.
We'll shake hands, and we'll shake your hands as well.
If there's any questions, we're happy to kind of respond to it now. I'll leave it on for like a minute, and if there's anything you want to ask, or if not, we'll leave it as that.
Yes. Good to see you all.